Welcome, welcome, welcome to Sacred Healing and Wholeness, where biblical truth and mental health wisdom work together in harmony. I'm Pastor Amy Jackson. Along with serving in ministry for more than 2 decades, I've earned multiple degrees in psychology, human service counseling, substance abuse counseling, and I continue pursuing advanced studies in clinical mental health counseling. I'm also a certified life coach, and so my passion is helping people discover that God cares about every part of their lives, including the thoughts that they wrestle with, the emotions they carry, and the burdens that they were never meant to carry alone. And so I want to thank you for joining me this evening. And today I want to talk on the subject of peace begins where control ends. Peace begins where control ends. And so I'm just going to ask you if you will not just but you will share this live with somebody else that might need it. When most people think about peace, they imagine calm circumstances. They imagine a life where problems have been solved, relationships are functioning perfectly, finances are stable, health concerns disappeared, and every unanswered question has finally received an answer. But if that were the definition of peace, then very few people would ever have an opportunity to experience it. And that is because life is constantly changing. One season brings opportunities, another brings challenges. One season feels unpredictable, but another feels certain. One door opens while another closes. One prayer receives an immediate answer while another remains unanswered for a while. Because life is always moving, peace cannot be built upon circumstances alone. And so if peace, depends on circumstances, then peace becomes fragile. And if peace and it comes and goes with every change, it's going to rise when things improve, it's going to disappear when difficulties emerge. It becomes something we chase rather than something we possess. And so many people live exactly that way. Their emotional state is determined by whatever is happening around them. When circumstances are favorable, they feel secure. When circumstances become uncertain, they feel overwhelmed. When answers arrive, they feel calm. When answers are delayed, they feel anxious. And so, what often goes unnoticed is that beneath those reactions is a powerful desire shared by almost anyone. And that is the desire to control, not necessarily to control people or to control situations, but to control the outcomes. And that is because as humans, we want certainty, we want predictability, we want assurance that things will work out the way we hope. And there is nothing unusual about that desire because it's a part of our humanity. The challenge begins when our desire for certainty becomes our requirement for peace, because life does not provide certainty very often. Think about some of the biggest decisions people make, like marriage and parenting and career changes, ministry assignments, moving to a new city, starting a business, returning to school. None of those decisions come with guarantees. So no one receives a complete blueprint showing every future detail before they move forward. And at some point, every major decision requires a willingness to proceed without having all of the information. Yet many of us spend years believing that peace will come once enough information arrives. We tell ourselves, when I know more, I'll relax. When I get clarity, I'll feel better. When I finally have answers, I'll have peace. But what if peace was never designed to come from answers? What if peace was designed to come from trust? That question then changes what peace might look like. Because if peace comes from answers, then we will always be vulnerable to uncertainty. But if peace comes from trust, then peace can exist even while questions remain unanswered. And so that doesn't mean questions are bad. Questions are normal, they're human. Questions can even lead towards growth. The issue is not whether questions exist. The issue is whether peace becomes dependent upon having every answer. And so one of the things I've noticed over the years is that people often think they are pursuing peace when they are actually pursuing control. The two can look surprisingly similar from a distance. Someone spends hours researching, someone creates multiple backup plans, someone repeatedly checks and rechecks details, someone analyzes every possibility, someone rehearses future conversations, or someone constantly evaluates potential outcomes. They tell themselves they are trying to find peace, but often they are actually trying to create certainty. And the problem is that certainty has limits. There will always be information we do not possess. There will always be situations we cannot control. And there's going to always be people who whose choices remain outside our influence. There will always be outcomes we cannot guarantee. And if peace requires certainty, then peace remains out of reach. And this is because this becomes particularly important when we think about healing. One reason many people struggle to move forward emotionally is because they are waiting for guarantees before taking the next step. They want guarantees before trusting. They want guarantees before trying again, or before hoping again, or before believing again. Yet healing rarely unfolds that way. Growth often requires movement before certainty can ever arrive. Faith is going to require movement before certainty. Obedience is going to require movement before certainty. Life itself requires movement before certainty. The desire for guarantees can quickly cause people to get stuck, not because they lack ability or lack intelligence or lack faith, but because they have convinced themselves they must know everything before they move. And the reality is that certainty is not the prerequisite of growth. Courage and trust and faithfulness and willingness are the prerequisites for growth. And so one of the reasons this topic matters so much is because control is rarely discussed in an honest way. People talk about anxiety, we talk about stress, we talk about burnout, we talk about exhaustion, but not often do we discuss the role that control plays in creating those experiences. Control often hides behind socially acceptable language. We call it being cared for, being prepared, or being responsible. And sometimes it genuinely is those things, but sometimes it is also something deeper. Sometimes it is the belief that we can manage enough variables, we can prevent discomfort. If we can anticipate enough possibilities, we can avoid disappointment. Or if we can prepare enough, we can eliminate uncertainty. But unfortunately, life consistently reminds us that uncertainty cannot be eliminated. It can only be navigated. That realization can feel discouraging initially, but it is actually freeing. Because once we stop trying to eliminate the uncertainty that life brings us, we can begin learning how to live well within that uncertainty. And so that is where peace starts becoming possible. Not because uncertainty disappears, but because our relationship with the uncertainty that life brings begins changing. So instead of seeing uncertainty as proof that something is wrong, we then begin seeing uncertainty as a normal part of being human. Instead of viewing unanswered questions as evidence that God is absent, we begin recognizing that unanswered questions have existed in every generation of believers. Instead of waiting for perfect clarity before moving forward, we begin learning how to trust God one step at a time. And that shift is very, very significant because peace is not primarily about what is happening around us. Peace is about what is happening within us. Two people can face the same situation and experience it very differently. One becomes consumed with fear, the other remains grounded. One becomes overwhelmed, the other remains steady. The difference is not always the circumstance. The difference is often where trust has been placed. Throughout this lesson, we're going to explore control from several different angles. Without repeating the same principles. And so peace is available to ordinary people living real lives with real challenges. So the question is not whether peace is possible. The question is where we have been looking for peace. And that is where we will begin on this evening. So next, I want to talk about how control develops in the first place and why so many people learn it long before they ever recognize it. How control develops. Most people focus on the behaviors of control without ever exploring where those behaviors came from. We notice the overthinking. We notice the difficulty relaxing. We notice the need to have a plan. We notice the frustration when things change unexpectedly. We notice the discomfort when answers are unavailable. But very few of us stop to ask a deeper question. How did control become so important to me in the first place? The answer is often more complicated than people realize. Control is rarely born from confidence. Typically, control develops from or a result of vulnerability. Control typically develops when life teaches us that things can change suddenly. It can sometimes develop when we discover that people can disappoint us, or when we experience situations that leave us feeling powerless, or when life becomes unpredictable and we begin searching for ways to feel safe again. Think about a child growing up in an unpredictable environment. They learn very quickly to pay attention. They learn how to anticipate moods. They learn how to read a room. They learn how to stay alert. And those skills may help them survive difficult circumstances. The problem is that survival skills often remain long after the environment has changed. So what once was protection can now become a pattern. The person grows older, but the need to stay ahead of everything remains, not because they are intentionally controlling, but because control became connected to their safety. And so this is important to understand because so many people judge themselves for their controlling tendencies without understanding the origin of the control. We become frustrated with ourselves. So many start to criticize themselves, start wondering why you struggle to relax or wonder why uncertainty feels so uncomfortable. Some wonder why they always feel the need to know what comes next. And often there's a story underneath those reactions. A story about protection or a story about survival, a story about learning how to navigate uncertainty long before they had the emotional tools to process the uncertainty. And so when we understand where patterns come from, we can approach them with compassion instead of shame. Compassion does not excuse unhealthy passions. Compassion simply helps us to understand them. And understanding creates room for change. It creates room for healing. Another way control develops is through success. And this might surprise some people because we often assume control grows out of difficult experiences alone. But sometimes control can actually develop because a particular strategy worked. So perhaps a person became highly organized and was rewarded for it, or they became highly responsible and earned praise for it, or they became dependable and found that people valued them for it. So, what happens is over time, they may begin believing that constant management is the reason everything goes well. The problem occurs when success becomes confused with control. A person starts believing they must personally manage every detail to keep life functioning. They become afraid to step back, or afraid to delegate, or afraid to take a rest or take a break, or afraid to loosen their grip, not because they enjoy carrying the load, but because carrying everything has become a part of their identity. So for some people, being needed feels safer than being at peace. Being productive feels safer than being still. Being busy feels safer than being present. Not because there is anything wrong with productivity, but because activity can become a distraction from deeper fears. Stillness has a way of revealing what activity often conceals. And so when life becomes quiet, unresolved fears become easier to hear. Unanswered questions become harder to avoid. Feelings we have been outrunning begin catching up with us. And so, for many people, control functions as a distraction from uncertainty. And so, as long as there is another task to complete, another plan to create, another problem to solve, there is less space to sit with what feels uncomfortable. And that is one reason some individuals struggle to rest. Rest is not difficult because they are lazy. Rest is not difficult. Rest is difficult because rest removes distraction. And so when distractions disappear, deeper issues often rise to the surface. And so this is why peace requires more than simply slowing down. It requires addressing what we have been trying to outrun. Another source of control comes from disappointment. Disappointment leaves an impression, particularly when it catches us off guard. A person trusts someone and gets hurt. A plan falls apart. An opportunity disappears. A relationship changes. A dream takes a different direction than expected. The disappointment itself is painful, but what often follows is a decision. Sometimes it is conscious, sometimes it is unconscious. The decision sounds like something like this: I never want to feel that way again. And that's completely understandable. No one enjoys disappointment. No one enjoys heartbreak. No one enjoys loss. But if we're not careful, that desire can gradually evolve into an attempt to protect ourselves from all future disappointments. We began seeking guarantees. We began demanding certainties. We began trying to predict outcomes. We start trying to control situations before they unfold. The irony is that the more we attempt to protect ourselves from disappointment, the more restricted our lives can become. We become hesitant to take risks, hesitant to trust, hesitant to hope and to dream and to move forward. What began as protection slowly becomes limitation. Another interesting source of control is fear of making mistakes. Some people carry a tremendous amount of pressure regarding decisions. Every decision feels significant. Every choice feels loaded with consequences. Every opportunity feels like it must be evaluated perfectly. And as a result, decision making becomes exhausting. The individual is not simply choosing, they are attempting to guarantee the correct outcome. The challenge is that life rarely offers that kind of certainty. And so most decisions are not made with complete information. Most decisions involve some degree of risk. Most opportunities require faith. People who fear mistakes often believe that one wrong choice can permanently derail their lives. And as a result, they become trapped in analysis. They spend more time evaluating options than actually moving forward. And so the goal is no longer wisdom. The goal becomes avoiding error at all costs. The approach creates tremendous pressure because human beings learn through experience. And so growth often happens through imperfect decisions. Wisdom often develops through trial and error. Maturity emerges through lessons we could not have learned any other way. And so when fear of mistakes becomes excessive, control begins taking over. Not because the person lacks intelligence, but because they are attempting to eliminate all possibilities of error. That is an impossible assignment. There is another root of control that deserves some attention: the desire for emotional safety. Everyone wants emotional safety. The question is where we look for it. Some people look for safety in relationships, some look for safety in achievement, in routine, in predictability, in control. The problem is that control cannot provide lasting safety. It can provide temporary comfort. It can provide the illusion of certainty. Control can create the appearance of stability, but it cannot guarantee outcomes. It cannot prevent every disappointment. It cannot eliminate every challenge or secure the future. And so eventually, reality will expose controls limitations. And so this is where many people find themselves exhausted, not because you're weak or lack faith, not because you're doing life wrong, but because you have been asking control to provide something it was never capable of providing, and that is security. Only God can provide true security, not through perfect circumstances or guaranteed outcomes, but through God's unchanging character. So understanding how controls develops is important because it changes the conversation. So instead of asking what's wrong with me, we be again asking, what have I been relying on for safety? That is such a much more productive question, because healing does not begin with self-condemnation. Healing begins with self-awareness. The awareness often reveals that control is not the problem itself. Control is often the attempt to solve a deeper problem. But the good news is that once we understand the deeper issues, we can begin addressing it. Now, I want to take a second to talk about the hidden cost of control and what it does to our emotional health, relationships, spiritual life, and ability to experience joy. Control will always cost something. At first, the cost may seem small: a little extra worry, a little extra planning, maybe a little extra mental effort. But over time, that cost will grow. What begins as a coping strategy gradually will become a way of life. And eventually, the person discovers they are paying a price they never had intended to pay. One of the first things control steals is mental energy. Every human being has a limited amount of emotional and mental capacity available each day. And so when that capacity becomes consumed by monitoring, predicting, preparing, and anticipating, there is less available for everything else. So then you have less available for creativity, less available for joy, less available for connection, less available for presence, less available for rest. Control becomes expensive because it requires constant attention. It asks the mind to stay engaged long after engagement is required or necessary. A conversation ends, but control will cause the mind to keep reviewing it. A decision is made, but the mind keeps evaluating. A plan is created, but the mind keeps adjusting it. A problem is solved, but the mind immediately begins searching for the next one. And so many people are physically sitting in one moment while mentally living in 5 others. Part of them is reviewing yesterday. Part of them was worrying about tomorrow. The other part of them is preparing for next month. Part of them is anticipating future challenges. Very little of them is actually present. And presence is one of the first casualties of control. And that matters because life is experienced in the present. Relationships happen in the present. Conversations in the present. Opportunities in the present. Moments with God happen in the present. And so when the mind is constantly occupied somewhere else, we often miss what is directly in front of us. And so this is one reason some people struggle to enjoy blessings that they even prayed for, because by the time the blessing arrives, their attention has already moved to the next concern. They spend years praying for the door to open. The door opens, instead of enjoying it, they immediately begin worrying about what could go wrong. They spend years asking for an opportunity. Opportunity comes. But instead of celebrating the opportunity, they began anticipating the potential problems from the opportunity. The pattern continues because control will not allow a person to fully arrive in a moment. It keeps pushing attention toward the next thing that needs to be managed. Another cost of control is relational strain. Relational strain. Healthy relationships require trust. Not perfect trust, not blind trust, but trust nonetheless. Somehow, control struggles with trust because trust involves vulnerability. Trust requires accepting that we cannot completely manage another person's choices. We cannot control what people say, how people respond, whether people always meet our expectation, whether others make wise decisions. Because of this reality, control sometimes attempts to manage relationships through pressure. Not necessarily intentional pressure, but pressure nonetheless. The person may constantly check, constantly monitor, constantly advise, constantly intervene, constantly attempt to prevent mistakes. Their intentions may be loving. Their motives may even be sincere, but the result can create tension because people generally do not thrive under excessive management. Healthy relationships need room to breathe. They need room for personal responsibility. They need room for growth and room for choices. But control struggles to provide that room. And so the result is that relationships can become exhausting for everyone involved. Another hidden cost of control is decision fatigue. Decision fatigue. Many people who struggle with control spend enormous amounts of energy making decisions, not because they have more decisions than everyone else, but because each decision receives far more attention than necessary. A simple choice becomes a lengthy evaluation. A routine decision becomes an extensive analysis, and an ordinary opportunity becomes a source of stress. And eventually, the mind becomes tired, not because the person lacks intelligence, but because every decision is treated as if it carries life-altering consequences. And over time, this is going to create exhaustion. Some people become so mentally fatigued that even small choices begin feeling overwhelming. What should be simple starts feeling complicated. What should take minutes takes hours. What should feel manageable begins feeling burdensome. Control creates pressure that the mind was never designed to sustain indefinitely. One of the less discussed costs of control is the impact it has on gratitude. Gratitude and control tend to focus attention in opposite directions. Gratitude focus attention on what is present. Control focus attention on what is missing. Gratitude notices what is working. Control notices what still needs attention. Gratitude appreciates progress. Control focus on unresolved issues. This does not mean controlled individuals are ungrateful people. It simply means their attention is often directed toward problems. The mind becomes trained to identify potential threats, risks, weakness, and concerns. While this skill can be useful in certain situations, it can also make it difficult to appreciate what is already good. And so then life becomes an endless series of problems to solve rather than moments to experience. And eventually, gratitude becomes overshadowed by management. That is a costly trade because gratitude nourishes the soul. Gratitude reminds us that not everything is broken. Gratitude reminds us that blessings coexist with challenges. Gratitude reminds us that goodness can still be found even during difficult seasons. But control often overlooks those realities because it remains focused on what requires attention. Another significant cost of control is reduced emotional flexibility. Emotionally healthy people are able to adapt. They adjust, they pivot, they respond to changing circumstances. But control struggles with adaptation because control prefers predictability. And so when plans change unexpectedly, frustration will increase. When timelines shift, anxiety increase. When surprises emerge, stress increases. The issue is not the change itself. The issue for a person who is operating in control is the expectation that life should remain predictable. Yet adaptability is one of the most valuable skills a person can develop. Life changes, relationship changes, responsibility change, opportunities change, health change, seasons change. The more emotionally flexible we become, the better we are able to navigate those transitions. But control will resist flexibility because flexibility requires your trust. It requires you to trust that we can handle what comes, to trust that God remains present, to trust that unexpected does not automatically mean disastrous. And without that trust, every change feels threatening for the person who is functioning in control. Another hidden cost of control is spiritual. Not because control makes someone less faithful, but because control can quietly alter the way a person relates to God, believe it or not. Prayer will become less about relationship and more about outcomes. Faith becomes less about trust and more about certainty. Waiting becomes less about growth and more about frustration. And so the person may still love God deeply. You may still serve faithfully, still pray consistently, yet internally, there is often a struggle to trust God in the spaces where answers have not arrived, a struggle to trust God when timelines differ from expectations or when outcomes remain unclear. The challenge is that spiritual growth often occurs precisely in those places, not when everything makes sense or when every question is answered, but when trust remains active despite uncertainty. And so control often fights against those conditions because control prefers explanation. Faith grows through mystery. One final cost that I want to bring up that deserves attention is that control narrows life. It narrows possibilities, it narrows experiences, it narrows opportunity. And so when safety becomes the highest priority, growth will suffer. People stop taking healthy risks. They stop exploring new opportunities, stop pursuing possibilities that require faith, stop moving toward things they cannot fully predict. And then eventually life becomes smaller than God intended. Not because opportunity disappeared, but because fear of uncertainty became stronger than the person's willingness to trust. And that is one of the greatest losses of all, because many of the most meaningful experiences in life require your trust. Meaningful relationships require trust. Purpose requires trust. Growth, calling, healing requires trust. The more we demand certainty, the more likely we are to miss opportunities that were never designed to come with guarantees. And so this is why understanding the cost of control matters, not so we can condemn ourselves or so we can feel guilty, but so we can recognize what control has been taken from us. Because once we understand the cost, we become more willing to consider a different path. And that different path begins with understanding what God says about trust, surrender, dependence, and peace. And so one of the challenges people often face pursuing healing is that is that they often expect growth to arrive dramatically, or they imagine a single breakthrough moment or a powerful revelation or a sudden transformation. And so, a day when every single struggle disappears and every thing instantly feels different. And so while those moments can happen, most growth will unfold much more quietly. Most healing from the need to control is going to happen gradually, or it happens in increments. Most transformations occur through small shifts that accumulate over time. And this is especially true when it comes to control, because people often assume that growth means never struggling with control again, or never worrying again, or never feeling uncertain again, or never experiencing fear again. And that's just not realistic. Growth is not the absence of human emotion. Growth is a different response to those emotions. The first sign of growth is often awareness. And so you begin noticing patterns that once operated automatically. You notice when your mind starts racing ahead. You notice when anxiety begins writing stories about the future. You notice when your need for certainty begins increasing. You notice when you're trying to solve a problem that does not belong to you. In the past, these patterns may have operated without your awareness. Now you can see them. That awareness is significant because change rarely happens before awareness. You cannot address what you cannot identify. And so many people underestimate the importance of small awareness because it feels small. Yet awareness is often the doorway through which transformation enters. The second sign of growth is pause. Is pause. In the past, a triggering situation may have immediately pulled you into that space where you need to control. An unanswered email or delayed response, a unexpected change, or a difficult conversation, a disappointing development. The reaction was automatic. Your mind immediately went to work. Now there is a pause, perhaps only a few seconds at first, but the pause matters because within that pause, choice becomes possible. And so you're no longer operating entirely on autopilot. You're no longer reacting automatically. You are beginning to respond intentionally. So growth often begins in those small spaces between stimulus and response. Another sign of growth is increased tolerance for uncertainty. And so this one is the most noticeable change. People who struggle with control often experience uncertainty as emotionally overwhelming. Every unknown feels urgent. Every unanswered question feels threatening. Every delay feels alarming. As growth occurs, uncertainty begins losing some of its power. Not because you suddenly enjoy uncertainty. Most people never do, but because uncertainty no longer automatically creates panic. You begin recognizing that not knowing does not necessarily mean danger. You begin recognizing that unanswered questions do not automatically signal disaster. You begin recognizing that uncertainty is a part of life rather than evidence that something has gone wrong. And so this shift of change starts to create a tremendous emotional freedom. Another sign of growth is flexibility. Rigid thinking often accompanies control. There's one acceptable outcome, one acceptable timeline, one acceptable solution. So when life deviates from that expectation, distress increases. Growth creates flexibility. You begin considering possibilities you previously ignored. You begin adapting when circumstances change. You begin recognizing that there may be more than one path forward. You begin understanding that God's provision is not limited to the specific outcome you imagine. So flexibility does not mean becoming passive. It means becoming adaptable. Adaptability is one of the most valuable emotional skills a person can develop. Life changes. Healthy people learn how to change with life changes. Another sign of growth is healthier relationships with responsibility. One of the reasons people become exhausted is because they confuse responsibility with ownership. As peace grows, that distinction becomes clearer. You begin recognizing what belongs to you. You also begin recognizing what doesn't belong to you. You become more comfortable allowing others to carry their own responsibility. You stop feeling obligated to rescue everyone. You stop feeling guilty for things outside of your influence. You stop assuming ownership of problems that belong to someone else. And so this shift often improves relationships dramatically, not because you care less, but because you care more wisely. Healthy care does not require unhealthy burden bearing. Another sign of growth is emotional availability. Control consumes attention. When attention is constantly directed toward managing life, very little remains available for enjoying life. And so, as peace grows, attention becomes available again because you become more present in conversations. You're more engaged with the family. You're more attentive to moments of joy, more aware of blessings, more capable of noticing beauty. More people are surprised by this change. So many people are surprised by this change. They expected peace to feel like relaxation. Instead, peace often feels like presence. And so for the first time in a long time, they are fully where they are, not mentally living somewhere else, not emotionally preparing for something else, simply present. Presence is one of the greatest gifts peace provides. Another sign of growth is improved decision making. This may sound counterintuitive. Many people believe control helps them make better decisions, but in reality, excessive control often complicates decision making because you have too many variables, too many scenarios, and too many possibilities and too many pressures. As peace develops, decisions often become clearer, not because uncertainty disappears, but because fear has less influence. Wisdom becomes easier to access when panic is not driving the process. You begin making decisions from conviction rather than anxiety, from discernment rather than fear, from values rather than pressure. And so then this creates greater confidence over time. Um, not confidence in your ability to predict the future, but confidence in your ability to navigate whatever the future brings. That is a very different kind of confidence. And one final sign of growth that deserves special attention is you begin becoming comfortable with being human. And I know that may sound simple, but it's not, because so many people live under tremendous pressure to be more than human, to know more, to do more, to fix more, to carry more, to manage more, to prevent more. And so as peace develops, that pressure begins lifting. And when that pressure begins lifting, you become more accepting of your limitations, more accepting of your need for God, your need for rest, your need for community, and ultimately your need for humanity. And so this may be one of the most beautiful aspects of growth because you stop demanding perfection from yourself. You stop expecting yourself to function as though you are all knowing. You stop expecting yourself to carry responsibilities that belong to God. You stop trying to be what only God can be. And in that space, peace begins flourishing because peace grows best in hearts that have accepted their limitations and embraced their dependence on God. So growth does not mean becoming fearless. Growth does not mean becoming perfect. Growth does not mean eliminating uncertainty. Growth means learning how to live faithfully without demanding complete control. Growth means becoming steady in places where you once became overwhelmed. Growth means becoming trusting in places where you once became fearful. Growth means becoming free in places where you once felt trapped. So I want to take this moment. I hope this helps somebody today. I want to thank you for spending time with me today. And so if this conversation encouraged you, challenged you, or gave you something meaningful to reflect on, I would love to invite you to join our Sacred Healing and Wholeness community. Sacred Healing and Wholeness is a space where faith and emotional wellness come together. It is a place for honest conversation. It is a place for practical growth, biblical truth, and a healing that addresses the whole person. And you can join us on the school platform at Sacred Healing and Wholeness. So thank you for being here. Until the next time, you do not have to control everything in order to experience peace. You only need to trust the one God, who is already holding what you cannot. God bless you, and I will see you next time in Sacred Healing and Wholeness.